that as we plan, there's not enough money.
The capacity planning could be scaled up to look after a national health insurance fund.
There's the issue of even believing that you could just tax 100 billion rand and get away with it.
Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special entitled South Africa's Healthcare Under the Knife. The National Health Insurance Plan is one that's been on the table for some time now, but it's only recently that real moves towards getting a concrete document have been made. But will this plan really deal with some of the fundamental challenges faced by the medical aid schemes, service providers and regulators?
It's not yet clear as to how the NHI will actually work. But as the first step, the Ministry of Health has put together a ministerial advisory committee made up of industry stakeholders who are reviewing the document. We've established that private sector players are in talks with the ministry, some as individuals like Discovery Health and Metropolitan through its GEMS business, and others through associations like the Board of Healthcare Funders. Most of the private medical scheme players say they're happy with the direction the plan is going. But critics say implementing a comprehensive medical aid for all South Africans is virtually impossible. Then there's the question as to whether the country can actually afford the plan. Original proposals by the ANC suggest the plan could cost around 100 billion rand a year. But more recent research done by consultancy group Econex shows government could have to come up with an extra 220 billion rand a year. That's over and above the money it already spends on public health, which currently accounts for 4% of the country's GDP. Something which analysts say the country simply can't afford.
Firstly, there's the issue of even believing that you could just tax 100 billion rand and get away with it. There is, secondly, the problem of actually creating an institutional model that requires far more than 100 billion rand in order to be vaguely functional. And really what the worrying part of the sort of proposals is the incredible naivety that underpins the view that you can actually do this and that it's actually a reasonable plan. It's not reasonable at all. Part of the problem as well is that we already have a universal free healthcare system, which you don't have to enrol for, which is paid for by taxes and will continue to be paid for by taxes. And any new money coming to the system will just be additional taxes used to fund that system. The institutional model itself makes very little sense to transform it, to get extra money. You don't need to change the whole institutional model to get extra money, but there is a limit to how much extra, realistically, the country is actually going to allocate to healthcare.
South Africa has a massive shortage of doctors and specialists, nurses and other resources. Based on current costing estimates, it seems like the NHI is either planning to fail or failing to plan.
There's not enough capacity. Like I said, if you build a house, you are not building it because you've got furniture. You now buy furniture because you've got a house. NHI is a plan. It's not an implementation. We know that as we plan, there's not enough money. We do not have enough capacity. We do not have enough doctors, human resources put that way. We do not have enough equipment. We may not even have enough facilities. But you must plan a situation that says, but if I want to cover all the citizens of this country, what do I need? You will only know what you need when you know how much responsibility you have.
Despite the challenges of costs and capacity, the private sector players we spoke to seemed confident that whatever happens, there needs to be a system overhaul, and the private sector needs to be integrally involved.
There is no doubt that the current state of the healthcare system is not sustainable and needs reform. The fact is that you've got this massive disparity between public and private. You've got a public system that, no matter how you measure it, is not meeting the needs of many South Africans. You've got people that just don't have access to healthcare, and that's not acceptable, it has to change. But I think what has happened that I think is important is, I think we're starting to realize no matter what we think, we don't have the resources required to offer incredibly rich, complex healthcare to every single South African. We just can't do that. If you look at the numbers, were we to provide a health system for every South African like the UK NHS, that would be half our economy it would cost. So, I think the original, the embryo of the NHI when it started being debated was very kind of ideological, and people using the public system felt the private sector had to stop People in the private sector were arguing the opposite, the public sector is mismanaged. The reality is, I think what's coming is that you need the both to work together.
Whether or not the NHI comes into being or perhaps another plan is developed, there are some fundamental issues impacting the growth of the medical aid industry. The thing is, healthcare is tricky. Human lives aren't a normal commodity. At the same time, private healthcare in South Africa is big business and needs to be regulated to protect the consumer. In 2004, the Competition Commission ruled against the then standard practice of collective bargaining between medical schemes, hospitals and doctors. This meant individual healthcare companies would then have to negotiate with service providers. For bigger companies like Discovery and Metropolitan, their size meant better bargaining power. Now the Ministry of Health is changing its tune to look at possibly reinstating the collective bargaining system. The Council of Medical Schemes, which is the industry regulator, explains.
We're dealing with a large case of market failure. Market failure commonly occurs in healthcare environment. It is a well-known, internationally known phenomenon, and internationally there has been a response to this to market failure. First of all, one needs to introduce measures to deal with the oligopolistic situation. We have only 3 major hospital groups representing 80% of hospital beds. That gives them very strong market power, which is very difficult to counter. We've made submissions to the Department of Health suggesting a bargaining council that would serve as a proper counter to this market failure. This process obviously will take time to settle because it requires a public consultation process, the drafting of a white paper, eventually going into legislation. But in the meantime, earlier this year, the Minister asked us for proposals, and we've made a proposal to the Department of Health on a temporary exemption from competition regulation so that there could be a public authority that on a temporary basis, as an immediate quick fix, set up such a negotiation process.
But will this ruling really have a role in giving smaller schemes a fighting chance in gaining more market share from the likes of Discovery?
Understand firstly the medical scheme, the Discovery of Medical Scheme is a separate legal entity. So it's profitability, in other words, if it gets discounts or whatever, that's for members. We get an administration fee, so it wouldn't affect our profitability. But would it affect the overall system's competitiveness? I don't think so. I don't think the differences are so stark that that's the issue. I think the issue of our sort of dominant mass and how we've kind of, how can I say, worked with the healthcare system gives us a very, very different competitive frontier.
South Africa's Medical Act is the ultimate legal premise that governs the industry. It only came into effect in 2000. In this act, medical schemes have to cover the costs related to any emergency medical condition, a set of around 270 medical conditions, and 25 chronic conditions. These are called prescribed minimum benefits. Pre-1994, this was unheard of. Since its inception, this law has been a major challenge for medical schemes to contend with in both administering and making money, as well as for the regulator to enforce. And some critics suggest that certain companies are using the National Health Insurance Plan to deregulate the industry.
What is of concern there is an extensive lobbying, using the NHI as a kind of a smokescreen to argue for massive deregulation of the private system. And I don't think that that's sort of very well understood, but part of the motivation for the deregulation of the system involved virtually the elimination of any system of prescribed minimum benefits that protects people at the moment from the arbitrary withdrawal of benefit by a medical scheme. Now that really aids the commercial interests of the medical schemes. It doesn't help patients very much when they suddenly find out that they're not covered for MRI scans, they're not covered for cancer drugs, they're not covered for anything that really matters when you need it.
The regulator suggests that the direction the NHI is taking is very focused on the consumer.
I would be very surprised if something like that comes out. There's a very strong pro-people and pro-public and public protection ethos that is supporting this whole process. But to speculate at this stage is dangerous.
But the Council for Medical Schemes says that regulation is not a once-off affair.
There's constant lobbying against those PMBs, and there's constant lobbying for watering down of those PMBs. The reasons are very simple. The arguments always come forth that it's too costly, that no one can afford it, we'll go bankrupt, we'll not be able to survive. And you hear passionate pleas saying, we are bleeding, help us, take away these PMBs. that does not help. PMBs are there to protect you and me as members of the public.
What's clear is that the South African regulatory environment is already a challenge for both the regulator and companies involved. A national health insurance plan is set to either sort these issues out or make them more complex. With this uncertainty, it's no wonder that companies are turning to other countries to mitigate the possible effects of the NHI.
18 months ago, there was a kickoff in terms of natural progression, but I think the NHI has made it all the more necessary and rapid in terms of pace, because the small players may not find themselves having a room in the future NHI-based healthcare industry. And it makes sense for them to pick and choose a partner, one big player that they can be part of going forward.
Metropolitan already has a strong presence in other parts of Africa and is looking further afield.
It's always sensible to start diversifying your income, and I think one of the strategies we have is to see to what extent we can apply our business model in other large markets, and particularly in Africa and even in the Middle East.
Discovery started its foray overseas a few years ago. An unsuccessful attempt in the United States didn't deter it from venturing into the UK and China. But it says South Africa remains its base camp.
You've got to be careful in these markets not to. They take time. I think China is going to take a lot of time. It's really, in the healthcare side, embryonic. The government is desirous of having an active health insurance market with private health insurers. So it's all directionally very positive, but I think it's going to take time. But I don't ever underrate the potential of South Africa.
The NHI is proving an attractive investment opportunity for foreign players. General Electric and other providers have already been making waves in the industry, and there's a feeling that there are going to be more opportunities than not.
I'm very bullish about this. I think in 5 years' time, we'll see the first phase of a national health insurance fund being implemented. I think we would see some significant changes in the way public sector health is being delivered in South Africa. And I think we're going to see some more consolidation. The other interesting thing is I think we will see new entrants coming into the market. We're already seeing some new entrants come into the market in the pharmaceutical space. And if we look at how we license providers in South Africa and we start reforming even in that area, we might be quite an attractive market for new entrants into the market from overseas competitors.
And even if the healthcare industry changes substantially, for the most part, those who have medical aid schemes will probably still be willing to pay more to make sure they get the same quality healthcare they always did.
I believe even if there's additional tax, for the first 10-20 years, most people will continue to buy private sector health plans until they really feel comfortable with the public sector quality of care has improved dramatically. So there's a bit of a tax burden, and the hospitals will see pressure on their pricing. But it's very hard to say, but I would say net, small negative for the sector, but I definitely would not be rushing out the door just because of this.
The healthcare space in South Africa is one that faces some unusual challenges. It's complex and filled with vested interests. The fact is that as an industry which directly impacts the lives of all South Africans, it needs to be in the best shape possible. And while many critics are concerned that the National Health Insurance Plan might not be the best way to achieve this, in the end, something's got to give. Whether it's this NHI plan or a better one or a combination of the proposed NHI and the current system. Either way, the private sector will be playing a key role. And just what that private sector will look like is anyone's guess. Thanks for watching South Africa's Healthcare Under the Knife.